Doing is recording. Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, which is hosted by Anti-Shelter. My name's Annie Taylor, and I'll be facilitating the discussion today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that, well, I actually don't know that most of us are up here in Darwin, but I am, and most of the Anti-Shelter team are. So I'd like to acknowledge that for us in Darwin, we're on Larrakia country, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd like to extend my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Throughout 2025, Anti-Shelter has run a webinar program, and we've had really brilliant attendance from the sector, from government agencies, and I'm really delighted to see that today is no different. We have almost 50 registrations for this event, so I'm expecting more people to come online as the moments pass. And we are recording this webinar, so we'll be putting it up on our YouTube and up on our website in the next couple of days. So if you've got team members who aren't able to be here today, there's still a way for them to access it. I'm really delighted that we're closing the year out with a really great piece of work that has been done by Jon Swain as part of his recent Churchill Fellowship on homelessness and heat. Jon's report is titled "The Heat Will Get Here Before the Housing: Solutions from America, Lessons for Australia." And it explores how communities in the US are responding to. I might just ask everyone to put themselves on mute if that's okay. We can hear a few microphones going off. Great, thank you so much. So Jon's report explores how communities in the US are responding to the increasing risks of extreme heat for people who are experiencing homelessness, and how these lessons can form effective and compassionate responses for people experiencing homelessness in Australia. The NT is really hot. We know that. And I think Jon's work is particularly relevant for us here. Jon has been engaging with our regional coordinator, Violet, who's on the line, zooming in from the airport in Tennant Creek. He's been engaging with Violet throughout this project, and we really appreciate that. And I think some of the lessons that you can see in Jon's report are really relevant to Central Australia, particularly Alice Springs, because it has that arid environment. Now, a bit of housekeeping. We are recording, so if you don't want to have your image shared, I mentioned this earlier that we are recording. If you don't want to have your image shared, just turn your video off, because we will put this up on social media. If you're comfortable with having your image shared, then totally fine. I think that's about it. The webinar should run for about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. We'll have a presentation by Jon. We'll have a Q&A session. And we'll have the chat running throughout, so you can pop your questions as Jon speaks in the chat, and we'll return to those questions at the end of his presentation. But before I get too far ahead of myself, I'd like to introduce Jon formally. Jon Swain is Homelessness Manager at the City of Sydney and has over 16 years experience at state, local and non-government homelessness services. Jon has a master's in social development from UNSW and an advanced diploma in community management. And I just want to thank Jon so much for taking the time today. It sounds like he's got a lot of work ahead of him this weekend. Sydney is warming up. And so your time, Jon, is hugely appreciated. I'm going to hand over to you. We've got 18 people on the line, which is fabulous. And we're really looking forward to hearing more from you about your work.
Thanks so much, Annie. I'll start sharing my screen, and this is always the fun part. Let's see if we can. I can't see everyone, so can everyone see this?
Yes.
Yep, and I'll just check that. Hang on a second. Is it changing over?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. For some reason with this PowerPoint, sometimes some of the images are disappearing, but I think I've rectified it, but we'll just see how we go. So yeah, let's kick off. Yep. So yeah, my name's Jon Swain, as mentioned, Homelessness Manager at the City of Sydney. So this Churchill Fellowship report, which came out a couple of weeks ago, sort of came off the back of a lot of experiences that we're seeing in the sector, where we're seeing more and more heat events. And at the same time, we're seeing like an increase in homelessness, but there was very few practical examples or sort of research done around this issue. And so I applied for a Churchill, was very fortunate to get one, and headed across to the United States. And so I can talk about heat forever, so I'll try and keep it to time. And yeah, and I guess look within this, um, heat is the topic for this particular conversation, but I think you can just put climate in general. I think the climate is changing in lots of variety of different ways, and a lot of these sort of practical sort of solutions from the United States, you could apply it not just with heat, you can apply it with cold, you can apply it with rain. So yeah, we'll go through. Yeah, I'd just like to acknowledge, yeah, I'm on Gadigal land at the moment, in Sydney and Eora Nation. Just pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd just like to acknowledge as well that a lot of what we're talking about here is like climate change, housing inaffordability, social injustice, sort of didn't exist before colonization. So I think this is sort of particular relevant. These are some of the badges I handed out to everyone I spoke to in the United States to sort of highlight that issue, that it's the sort of for First Nations community. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as well. That's a picture of myself. And he's done a great spiel of who I am, so I don't need to go into it. That's me in Yuendumu. So I lived in Yuendumu for about a year and a half with my dad and my mum, and a dog and cats. I lived on community. So I always have a bit of a soft spot for the NT, and I come back quite regularly. So I just thought I'd put that in there, just a bit about myself. All right. So the Australian context of why we're talking about heat and then why we're talking about homelessness. I think everyone would have seen, hopefully, the National Climate Risk Assessment report that came out it was about a couple of months ago now. I've said it before and I'll say it again. It's probably the most, like, it's an excellent document, it's an excellent report, but it's also terrifying. And I don't think it gets talked about enough. It's sort of slipped in and out of sort of public discussion. It's basically the federal government doing really detailed analysis on the risks that we are facing as a country. And in particular, I've just highlighted some of the sections around heat deaths. So if you see here, that's the projected heat percentage change for heat-related deaths in various capital cities. You'll see for Darwin, I think it's the 3-degree change, we're looking at a 400% increase in heat-related deaths. And that's by 2050 or 2090 is one of the two upcoming sort of data points. But also the exposure and vulnerability. So the factors that increase risks of heat deaths, including heat status, socioeconomic status, housing composition, housing conditions, all of these things sort of already existing risk factors for people that are experiencing homelessness. There is also things like if you're antipsychotic medication, if you're cardiovascular diabetes, you're at risk of heat stress. So if we're seeing like a 400% increase in heat-related deaths, it's a big risk factor. Add into that like heat is more and more becoming recognized as the biggest killer as a natural disaster. I think part of the issues with heat and heat-related deaths is that tracking. So when someone presents to the emergency department with cardiovascular issues, it's not always recorded that that person came out from working outdoors in 44-degree heat. They're presenting for one thing, but it's not always recorded as the actual other factor. But I'll go into that in terms of what's happening in the United States. So that's the sort of future projection around those risks. But already now we're seeing these sort of heat-related risks emerging now. See if I can change the screen. And then the consequences are obviously within this National Climate Risk Assessment report, outlines the risks and the confidence that how severe this is going to be. And they also recommends types of responses. This is what we're talking about now to sort of reduce those risks. So it's enhancing efficiency within our assistance, efficient systems and adjustments, but also innovation as well. And I thought I'd just point this out as well. It's not just heat as in like heat, but there's also other related things to a warming climate, which is seeing mosquitoes, food and water risks. We're also seeing communicable diseases as well. We're seeing increase in rats in Sydney amongst people that are sleeping rough as well, huge numbers. And there's more and more research around that and the correlation with heat. There's also the risk to self-determination within the report for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, land, remote and rural communities. So this National Climate Risk Assessment is massive. It's 238 pages. Interestingly, within the document, it doesn't really mention homelessness. it's only mentioned a handful of times, and yet I'll get into it. We're talking about a climate that's changing, but we're also talking about a homelessness rate that's increasing across the country. So this is a little snapshot. So the map on there is the sort of projected future heat waves. And then the map with the little blue dots is from my state, New South Wales, our statewide street count. And that sort of shows the where everyone is currently, they're finding people sleeping rough across the community. It's gone up across the last couple of street counts about 23, 24% each year. I've had reports from councils with good authority in other states of around 1,200 people sleeping in bushland along riverbanks. So I think this is a massive underestimate. But we're seeing homelessness emerge in rural, regional communities, areas that they weren't normally experienced before. At the same time as you're seeing climate and heat-related incidences also increasing and forecasted to increase. So you're seeing a homelessness rate forecasting to increase at the same time as you're seeing climate rates and the heat-related incidences also increasing. And I just thought I'd point this out. I just pulled this from the website, the new BOM website, which I had to navigate today because we're doing some heat work in Sydney, but just on the NT around a heat wave alert. And I just wanted to just draw attention to the advice. And this is pretty standard across most of the country, which is if you're going to keep cool, you go to a library, you go to a shopping centre, you stay at your home. But there's no advice around what do you do if you don't have a home, or what do you do if you can't enter a shopping center? What do you do if you're sort of as we're seeing more and more of a move on type atmosphere for people experiencing homelessness, and there isn't naturally shaded areas? Where are the alternatives? So my Churchill, yeah, like I said, went to the United States. I chose the United States specifically, mainly because like per capita, we have the very similar rates of homelessness. I know everyone always thinks America is like leaps and bounds ahead of everyone else in terms of homelessness, but per capita are very similar. I went to Los Angeles, Houston, Austin, Phoenix, New Orleans, Washington, and New York for different reasons, different climates. So Phoenix, very similar climates to parts of the NT. New Orleans, very similar to bits of Sydney and up and down the coast, that high humidity. So just to get a comparison of how different heat responses for different areas. But also they had very established services centers, city plans. And so that was sort of the approach. Across this, I spoke to about 70 odd people. So authors, academics, city official government workers, NGOs, not-for-profits, people with lived experience. So it's sort of captured within this report. In summary, I would say the United States is about 2 to 3 years ahead of us in terms of their heat responses. So like bad news, I guess, for Australia, we're still behind, but the good news is they've sort of laid out a roadmap for us to follow, and it's not too hard for us to catch up, I would say. But across the board, every single capital city that I visited had some sort of heat process, heat protocol, cooling shelter activation, coordination of homelessness services, which I'll go into. So all the examples, every city I visited had this already established. Generally, they'd been established for about 3 to 4 years. So the first lesson that came out of the States was just around training and education. So one thing that the Homelessness Centre services and a lot of frontline services that are dealing with it, we have no heat training, heat awareness. It's something that people are looking for more and more sort of, I guess, aggressively at the moment to try and find solutions around identifying heat stroke, heat stress, but not just heat, any sort of climate related intervention. So that was something that was standardized across most of the cities I spoke to. They had that heat training for health workers and other frontline services. They also did a lot of training for their coroners and emergency departments on identifying heat deaths and heat injuries, which improved a lot of their data collection, which I'll get to as well a bit later on. And there's great heat awareness campaigns via the media that I observed as well. So you'd have like news departments recording, they'd be informing the public basically of the risks of heat very differently to how we would talk about it in the media here. Oops, sorry guys, someone's just talking. Thank you. So yeah, really good heat awareness from the media, but also around their reporting. So they did a lot of training with their media departments to make sure that they're conveying the right heat awareness and heat messaging. And lived experience was also integrated in a lot of this sort of development. So that was the first step, was like you need to start training and educating community and services that are responding to these risks. And then the next one was and preparing in the cooler months. So review past summer responses and adjust to how those responses worked using data to budget and plan and prepare, because that's a big issue is around resourcing, which I'll get to. Ensuring your infrastructure is prepared, backup power. A great example is New Orleans. Their backup power went down in one of their cooling shelters, which was a community center. They said within half an hour, he had the windows and walls dripping with condensation and sweat. It was like it was a massive disaster. So if you're going to have all these people in a cooling space and your power goes down, you need to have something there. So that was a lot of lessons learned. Most of them all ran desktop exercises. So an example of this would be for the NT or Alice, say Alice Springs, you get like 7, 8, 10 days in a row of high 40s, and you've got X amount of people that don't have access to cool shelter. How would you suddenly respond? So running through those scenarios to begin to build up what sort of responses might be needed. Every city had a heat protocol. So within New South Wales, City of Sydney has a heat protocol for people experiencing homelessness. No other LGA, I think maybe Inner West Council has one. South Australia is the only one I know that has a dedicated statewide protocol for people experiencing homelessness, and they have a code red and code blue for hot and cold. Most other areas don't have one. A lot of places are looking at it. And of course, there's like statewide heat sub-plans, but for people experiencing homelessness, if you've got antipsychotic medication, other comorbidities, your heat risk and health risk is much higher than the general population and generally needs to be activated earlier. So one of the lessons were generally in the United States, every city would activate around 30 to 35 degrees, like a baseline, and then we'd also activate a high risk threshold at 40 degrees. For the NT, consider what Phoenix is doing. They activate their emergency heat alerts from the beginning of summer to the end of summer, and that just changes how they activate the stand up, stand down. And I'll go into details about why they do that. The other thing that they talk about as well is considering historical temperature activation. So if you're suddenly getting spikes where it's 15 degrees hotter than it would do, even in winter, they're sometimes activating heat responses because there's more and more research that our bodies are not conditioned to those sort of swings, and that presents health risk for vulnerable populations. Everyone had cool spaces, without a doubt, like every city. Doesn't matter, like, and most cities, even in the middle of ICE raids that are happening in the US, would also open that up to people that are undocumented as well, people without residency status. So it's assessing all the community spaces. So, I mean, church spaces, government-owned spaces, NGO spaces, what is suitable, what is available. But within that, there's also risks. If you're using libraries, you need support services to be added, which is a resource intensive, so that may not be suitable. Mobile cooling options, like the ones that the City of Sydney has developed, is also something that a lot of the cities were identifying is probably something that's needed for remote communities as well, setting up cool spaces on site. And it needs consistency, so you can't have a cool space in one area and then move it somewhere else, because then someone's walking 6 kilometers in the heat to access it. The other thing is a lot of the cities had free transport options, which is difficult in different areas, but again, looks back at that mobile cooling hub. If you can set it up on location rather than having someone move to the location, it removes the need for transport. Coordination is the other component. So you just need someone to lead all the services when you're doing heat responses for homelessness communities. So someone to lead it, to coordinate all the various services. So for, mostly it fell to cities, but other times there were other sort of leads that would take that role. There's also regular meetings, which was really interesting, between emergency departments, homelessness departments, and health departments, which traditionally don't always work together. So I mean, like emergency and disaster. And they would meet sometimes for half an hour once every 2 weeks. That would include police and other combat agencies. And it just built those relationships. So when you did have some sort of climate related disaster, you already had those relationships embedded. And so it's something that was quite unusual, but all the cities did it. And you need to be mapping the resourcing and coverage to reduce duplication. So different areas will be different, but if you're a small regional rural area and you've only got X amount of services and you're all covering the same area, then how can you spread those resources? How can you leverage other sort of services to also assist during a heatwave response? Health was the critical component, and I don't have a good answer for it. But I think most of the cities had some sort of health outreach, and it's sort of needed. It's a health response. Heat is a public health response. There's nothing else I can sort of say to this. And I think if you don't have health leading a lot of this, it's really, really difficult because there's so many inherent health risks to heat waves, and they need to be integrated and leading it. And they also have a greater authority, I think, than a lot of the homelessness services. So there is a big case to continue that funding of outreach services, especially as homelessness is growing. In New South Wales, St Vincent's Homeless Health has a team of 50 for the 340 we have in our area. Byron Bay has about 360, and I think they have one or two health workers that do outreach. So that discrepancy between the two, I think it needs to be looked at. But I don't have a clear answer for that one, but it is something that was reiterated to me from all the cities. And then alerting, you need one source of truth to alert these activations. So I think that's a sort of growing space. Like people can get these alerts from different spots, and it's like you look at 3 different weather apps, and they're all very different. So it's having that one source of truth for who declares that heat wave activation, and then trialing all these different ways to get it out to remote and homelessness communities. So outreach, SMS, media, radio, community, which is all built in through the training and education. And if outreach is finite, then it's really about making those tricky calls about who needs it first and getting out there and getting to those most vulnerable populations. So if you know there's someone that's quite unwell, that maybe uses drugs or alcohol, heavily intoxicated, sleeping in a poorly ventilated tent, they would be the person you need to be getting out to first, rather than say someone that's probably got a better level of cognitive ability, which comes through the training as well. I just wanted to point out this one because I think it's a huge risk that we're all going to start facing. So this is a great quote from Taylor from New Orleans. That's the hospital that was devastated during Katrina that is still empty. That's from 20 years ago. And that sits in the middle of the city. But that quote around heat responses, it was highlighted through the Los Angeles Emergency Department when I went through their Emergency and Disaster Command Center. During the LA fires, they said and the desk it's a massive area. It's probably holds about 100 people. During the LA fires, every single desk was operated and manned. During a heat wave, they said it'll be a desk of maybe 2 people. And so that resourcing becomes quite intensive. And so it's really looking at, if we're constantly declaring heat waves, it's putting a massive strain on our frontline workers that are already experiencing a lot of strain and resource and burnout. So looking at that, looking at the budgets, looking at how we scale it up, considering volunteers. The quick solution that was mentioned was just declaring heat waves to give the same disaster response as you would a flood or any other natural disaster. That was sort of the feedback from the states, because that activates in additional funding and additional resources. But until then, it's looking at what's available within our current capacity. And within that, community-based organizations, so NGOs, community-run organizations are a massive ally in terms of doing a lot of that response and sort of supporting communities that who are experiencing homelessness during heat waves. So a lot of the ones in LA were the first to respond during the wildfires. They were the quickest on the ground, and I think the same thing would prevail during a heat wave. One in particular uses a neighbor philosophy where they don't refer to someone who's unhoused or homeless as that. They refer to them as neighbors, and it changes how people view someone. So it's like you check on your elderly neighbor in a house the same way you check on the neighbor of someone living at the end of your street. That during a heat wave, it's that same, it's changing, it's building that social cohesion and leveraging that in terms of how we respond. But I think using CBOs and other sort of volunteer groups to sort of help and educate and support during heat waves takes pressure off our frontline services. Water is massive. I didn't really take it for granted. Probably different for everyone up the NT and other areas, but in Sydney, we've got access to a lot of water fountains, but I was in LA and there's only a handful. And so Water Drop LA, who I did outreach with, would hand out gallons of water to people experiencing homelessness in Skid Row. And basically that was their only form of water access for the day. And it came up a lot, basically. If you don't have water security, you don't have water access, a lot of this falls down. And it's something that we're looking at in terms of our responses to ensure that the cooling centres have access to water. What happens if something happens to water access, having reserves there basically as well. But it was, massive risk, and particularly for rural, regional areas or remote areas, having that water access, not everyone has it. This is like my number one with a bullet, I think. I would say, in terms of my response is data. I'll go into what the city of Phoenix does with their data a bit later, but cities that started publishing death data and heat-related death data got massive responses from the community, from politicians. It changed how people started looking at heat. It changed how heat-related sort of risks were assessed. It required a little bit of work to train coroners' offices and health departments, but once it was running, and regularly hosting and publishing detailed, accessible reports, and Phoenix does it particularly well. It changes how we measure our sort of our responses. It changes public awareness. It's a key component to this, and it's not overly difficult to start doing. But yeah, it's just something that just came in time and time again, was the data, publishing death data, publishing heat stress, heat stroke data, and then I won't touch on this too long, but the digital twins and I think, and so digital twins, I had no idea what this was. I went to a conference. Basically, it's incorporating multiple types of digital information, so data points. So it could be there's a particular location where, say, there's a men's hostel, and you capture how many 911 call, or sorry, 000 calls are there during a heat wave, how many people, and then you get the data of how many people were presented to a hospital from this location. And then you might want to map in the heat footprint. So from the sort of thermal readings on the footprint of how hot it gets. And so combining all these different data points to see how well your responses are, where you should target your responses, but also ways you can mitigate it. So if it's a particular hot area, you're getting a lot of 000 calls during heat waves, what are the cooling strategies that we can do to reduce that? And then we can also measure it down the point. So digital twins and AI is beyond my technical skills to explain with great depth, but it's something that's really interesting as we sort of, as this sort of AI revolution just starts fast tracking as well. Yeah, so I think it is going to be a massive component in terms of how we do a lot of that work. I think as a sector, I'll talk about New South Wales. Within the homelessness sector, data and technology is something I always feel we're quite behind compared to other areas like corporate space or the private sector, but hopefully we can catch up a little bit, because I think it changes how we respond to a lot of these issues. The other one was just new heat teams. And what I mean by that is it's sort of happening naturally, even within Australia, but there's just new teams that we don't traditionally work together. So as climate becomes more embedded in a lot of our work, it'll be public health, emergency services, the sustainability sector, design sector, all working together around how do we respond to the sort of emerging climate, at the same time homelessness and vulnerable populations. Academics, researchers, we're all sort of working together, but working out how to sort of improve each other's work. Sometimes historically we've all done it in isolation, but I think these formalized partnerships are becoming more and more common. And it's something that's very effective as well. I know that for a lot of the work that I do in the city, our relationship with Sydney University and the sustainability teams has a lot of I guess, respect and sort of authority within the city of Sydney when we talk about certain issues. And this likewise when we have the public health teams working with us. So collectively, when we're all working on an issue, it gets a stronger response, but also greater solutions. I want to talk about this, and this I think is something that may have resonance within the Northern Territory. It is something that I've seen repeated in Australia across many states and territories. I think it's growing as well, which is essentially we're building these sort of healthy green cities. But at the same time, if you're experiencing homelessness or you look like you're experiencing homelessness, you're getting pushed out. And what I mean by that is in various parts of the United States, you saw bridges that were sort of enmeshed so people couldn't camp underneath them where they're naturally cool. We're being sort of quietly moved out of the CBDs, which are being cooled, and into sort of hotter areas. There's a lot of negative campaigns being run around homelessness in general as it grows, and there's that economic tension. And it's something that I've seen repeated without naming areas or states or territories. We're not immune to it. I think the vitriol against people experiencing homelessness is getting stronger as the problem, as the numbers sort of increase as well. But what it means is then we're also creating these cool cities and cool spaces. But if you're experiencing homelessness, we're pushing you out into hotter areas and like more rural areas or remote areas where you can't access those supports. And I think collectively as a sector, we owe it to sort of be really focusing on this because it's happening everywhere, and it's sometimes happening under the guise of crime and safety or other sort of forms of sort of responses. And I think it's an emerging issue, and I think within the United States it's massive, and it's something that we're definitely doing. And I think we're losing that empathy. I think Jeff Goodall in that quote that he puts there, like we're definitely being challenged around that empathy doesn't matter because you see YouTube videos, media, and Instagram sort of clips of these sort of negative homelessness campaigns that are quite effective in terms of how the public engages with it. And from a climate point of view, I think it's a massive risk, not just from a climate, but just generally. And so one of the solutions is from the States is there's great data, but we don't have great stories. And so there's great data on heat deaths, but we don't have great stories in terms of what is the impact on heat on an individual. A great example of that is in Australia, we did some interviews for Parity Magazine, and some of the responses were around just when it's really hot, it's really hard and humid, it's hard to treat wounds. Like your wounds are constantly leaking, you can't sleep, the aggression, irritation, having that sort of lived experience voices around this is what it's like, but then also using it effectively and consistently. And I think we're not there yet. I know Invisible Peoples, who I quoted. So Mark Horvath, some of you may know, he's on LinkedIn and Instagram. He does really effective homelessness messaging. And one of his big things when I met him was that we sort of, the homelessness sector isn't fast enough to sort of catch up with modern media. We don't do it effectively. He's quite good at it. I think a lot of what he does is challenges some of our thinking, but it also combats some of the sort of negative opposite views on homelessness as well. And so I think it's like, how do we use modern media a lot smarter to sort of build that empathy, but also reassessing homelessness as a worsening public health risk against climate change. We always knew that homelessness was a health risk. Climate's going to double it, basically. It's a massive public health risk. But also, like as Eric Kleinenberg, who wrote the Heatwave novel, the Heatwave book about the Chicago heat waves that resulted in 700 deaths, we need housing, but we also need housing that's assessed against the National Climate Risk Assessment. It needs to be climate proofed. There's no point building houses that aren't going to withstand a changing climate in 10 years' time. So it is that tension there as well. But I think I just look at that National Climate Risk Assessment report. I look at homelessness, and I'm just like, we're basically saying it's not safe to be outside, but we're leaving people outside. But at the same time, we've also got social housing that potentially not safe to be inside. So there's a huge amount of work there around that. And part of that is changing the public narrative around it because not many people talk about it. So yeah, unified, consistent messaging with strategic partners. We need more human stories. In the US, the union workers are looking at using Instagram to tell stories about outdoor workers related deaths to build traction because it is around humanizing those risks as well. And we need to be better with the media. And I think from what America was saying and what you've heard from Australian colleagues, we're sometimes losing that narrative. So I just thought, I'm just keeping an eye on time as well. I'm pretty not too bad. So I just thought I'd quickly mention the Northern Territory and the city of Phoenix. So city of Phoenix, really interesting. They've got a homelessness population of about 1,000, but it's the fastest growing city in the US. Super hot. Like I think from the beginning of summer, it's about, I think when I was there, it was about 45 degrees every day. And so what they started finding as the city grew was they was also seeing the heat growing and worsening. So the city of Phoenix has a dedicated heat office, which is essential. And I think most cities need to start. I know the city of Melbourne has one, but I reckon the NT definitely needs one. And so they've started putting some heat mitigation tools in place and some really interesting work around heat. So I thought I'd use this as an example because City of Phoenix has dry heat, very similar. I know like Darwin's humid, but I think for the central parts and there's definitely some learnings there that I thought might be applicable. Circle the City is a dedicated health service with about 30 million per annum budget. This is what they see on the street. So heat stress, heat stroke, third degree burns. I did outreach with them. I've never seen so many people with heat burns. So basically it's from when people overdose, pass out on the concrete, and just basically they cook. And we caught people that had sort of OD'd or had drug-related sort of incidences where they'd sort of passed out in the sun, and we just caught them before the shadow had left where they'd passed out. Otherwise, they would have been admitted to the emergency department. There's skin peel, amputation. The risks are sort of growing as the heat's growing. Last summer, there was 600 deaths, 300 were unhoused. Um, and I guess this is part of their public reporting and data collection that they've started been doing that changed the narrative around how they responded to heat waves. Once they started publishing heat deaths, there was a sort of urge and a drive from the community to provide responses. So on the bottom there is a map of all their different cooling options. So you've got hydration stations, you've got libraries, you've got pop-up cooling centers, you've got augmented centers, which are like crisis centers with extended hours. So it's a range, it's massive. There's nothing else like it. But they also publish weekly data on how many people are accessing the cooling shelters and the sort of breakdown. So that's their yearly report. So 33,000 people accessed cooling shelters, 30,000 were unhoused, which shows the need of what is the population base that needs it. But they break that down to weekly. So every week they're publicly publishing, this is how many people access these cooling shelters. But because they had this data, they were also able to project what staffing they need, what the need is, and within that, I highly recommend people look at their City of Phoenix heat plan with a lot of their sort of the targets they're looking at, training, education, etc. Because I think for the NT, it has a lot of application as well, because there are more remote areas as well that they have to target within that. And this is another really interesting example. So this is a safe outdoor space. It looks really dystopian in a way. Basically, it came about the community sued the city. There was a huge encampment, and they sued City Hall. The community won, and so as a response, the city had to close down the encampment, but also find an immediate solution. So they bought out a disused car park, which had a massive warehouse, and they partners with an architect to build all these sort of like cooling, like shipping containers with air conditioning, backup power for people to be housed in. But then they also put in these tents under these awnings with massive industrial fans that people could reside in if they didn't feel comfortable being indoors. And then within the warehouse next door, they had this massive air conditioning units, case management, chill out areas. So it was like setting up a really quick pop-up area, because what they recognized is like it's not perfect, and like you walk through it, there's 300 tents and it feels like something out of a sci-fi movie, but it provided that immediate heat response to people. It was a cool space, it was a safe space. People had that case management, and I think they've housed about 1,500 people since the program existed. So it sort of challenges how we look at homelessness and how we need to respond, but that's the need and the speed that they need to do it, because the heat's getting so severe in Phoenix that they can't wait for this magic solution. They have to come up with these sort of rough and ready type solutions. But I thought it was interesting and just worth pointing out. And then just finally, I guess these are some of the City of Sydney responses. So we've got an emergency heat protocol response. That's our mobile cooling hub. And then this is the Heat Watch app that people may be familiar with. The Sydney University built it, and that's that one source of truth. So more and more heat protocols are sort of looking at this as the sort of leading sort of example of what we can use to activate during a heat wave. You basically put in your pre-existing health conditions, and it tells you your risk against what the heat is currently forecasted to be. So it might be a low heat risk, but if you've got other sort of risk factors, your risk might be severe and you need to be out of the heat. So it's a really good example. I'm going to leave you with an update. It's a very depressing conversation sometimes. I'm going to leave you with a sort of uplifting one from Jeff Goodall. And it's true. I think 6 years ago, no one was talking about heat. I think more and more we are talking about heat now and responses, and there are ways to mitigate some of this. So housing and sustainable housing and climate-proof housing is the answer. But in the meantime, we need to come up with other sort of ways to respond. And I just that's my favorite quote from the report, which sort of highlights where we are. And then on the other side is just a poem from someone I met who was typing up poems on a typewriter, but also happened to have been unhoused and currently was still unhoused. And so he wrote that out for me. So, but I think that like we've all known that this is happening. We have no housing. We have no, like the climate's getting worse. But I feel like it's disproportionately impacting those experiencing homelessness at this stage. So yeah. And I think that is it. I think I hit time, so I'll stop
Thanks,
sharing.
John. You did perfectly hit time. Um, yeah, wow. Great presentation. So much in that um, to delve into. I think what stuck with me is the fact that there are people who are getting burns from lying on the pavement or from sitting on the pavement. Like I'm sure that's also happening in Alice Springs, where there was a study done a few years back called Heat in Alice or something similar. I think it was done by Menzies, but I might be wrong. Um, Someone online might know, but it looked at the heat on the pavements in Alice Springs and the huge temperatures that they were getting up to. It's just so shocking. I have so many questions. Before I dive into opening it up for other people's questions, I also just want to quickly acknowledge formally the attendance of Mayor Asta Hill, who's online, the Mayor of Alice Springs, who jumped in at some point and I didn't notice. So apologies, Asta, that I didn't formally acknowledge your attendance. But thank you so much for engaging with this work, which I think, as I said earlier, is very relevant to Alice Springs. So I do want to open up the floor to questions. None have come through in the chat, but please just raise your hand, take yourself off mute, and fire away. While you're thinking, while we're waiting for hands to go up, John, I wanted to ask you, I guess, the first question, kick things off, is my question is, so you spoke about SA and the fact that SA government leads statewide Code Blue, Code Red response in SA. And it's the only example in Australia, and everywhere else it seems like it's local government who is stepping into this space of having a heat response or a weather response. What is, I guess, the recommendation? Ideally, who do you want coordinating this piece of work?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I think, I mean, like I said, I could talk about this for hours and it's really hard to give a really broad overview. But I think one of the things we did at City of Sydney, we did a microclimate report. So we deployed 200, and if I can find it, I can chuck it in the chat. We deployed 200 heat readers across our local government area and compared it to what the Bureau was reporting. And we saw like massive variances of like 10 degrees in some areas, especially with high populations of people experiencing homelessness. So it's sort of, I guess, reinforced for us why sometimes having a locally based protocol works. Having said that, South Australia's one's really interesting because they can also localize it. So they can div it by region. So I guess I mean, I don't know if there's a best, what is best. I think it starts out generally as a locally placed response sometimes because it's easier to do that than it is to get state or territory sort of endorsement because it's sometimes a bit trickier. Um, but I think more and more, I think it's going leading towards a local based response because, yeah, just because people are just needing it. And I think it's just taking a bit of time. Yeah, I don't really have a clear answer on that. Like talking to the states, they also were in two minds about what is best. I think they were just like, as long as you have one, basically. Yeah, I think that's the key. You just need to have one. And there's nothing to stop you from having a statewide one and then looking at having some local ones within that might trigger before the state one.
Yeah, great. That's really interesting because in the NT we have a wet weather response up here in Darwin, which is a necessity. Obviously, that got activated before our cyclone that we had 2 weeks ago. But we don't have anything in Alice Springs in terms of our hot or cold weather
Yeah.
response. In Darwin, we don't have a hot weather response for people who are sleeping rough, but I think there's definitely a bit of an appetite shifting for what could be done. But how could homelessness services potentially take the lead for that? Um, so yeah, there's evolving conversations, and I think now's a great time to be having them, as you know, Violet and I have discussed with you, because there is additional homelessness funding in the system. Okay, anyone else got some questions? Stick your hand up. Mike.
Yeah, I'll give it a go. So, John, that was a good presentation. So, I'm Mike Byrne. I'm in the office with Annie up here at NT Shelter. So, I guess the questions I have is about how do we set the levels for activation? Because somewhere like Darwin, which is hot all the time, is different to somewhere like Melbourne that has
Yeah.
sort of, like a heat wave in Ireland is 25 degrees, where a heat wave up here is like 35. So how do you set the levels? Is that something we have to work more with the medical
Yeah.
people on, because it's, it's hot all the time, and we have this problem with the wet weather response. At what point, because it's wet often for 6 months of the year, so at what point do you say yes, it's open and shut? So is there anything that's already published on that, or is that just something we have to go to local medical associations or researchers like Menzies and ask their advice?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think within the States, it was often done with the public health team and the emergency disaster team. They'd set a threshold, and I think it was generally, they're also looking at lowering it as they get better at it, which was interesting as well. And I think, yeah, so I think we partner with the Sydney University Heat and Health Lab, so Professor Ollie J, which has a lot of weight around this sort of heat work, but also with our health departments, and they sort of set it. And I guess because, like I said, it's a public health response, we sort of follow their advice there. In terms of the activation, I guess that's the consideration. So Melbourne, you could probably get away with just activating as needed for the short term. But a good example of this is, and this is why Phoenix does it, it's that constant standing up and standing down, which becomes an issue. So for example, I've got a heat wave alert potentially for this week, which means I might probably going to be working on the weekend. But then and so I'm sort of doing it outside of BAU. But I guess for Phoenix, they activate at the beginning of summer to the end of summer. You can sort of start resourcing for that. And I was in Washington and I get their heat wave alerts. They were declaring one every third day. So I reckon in about 2 summers' time, they're going to probably follow the same path of just going, we start at summer, we end at summer, because then we can resource accordingly. But then I think the harder conversation changer for Phoenix was people were saying it's always hot in Phoenix. And then so they needed that data to sort of show, to highlight this is the need. And that required the health teams and the universities to come together and say, no, 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 no. That's an old way of thinking. This is the data that backs up that people are dying from this. And I can see if I can find some research in some of the papers and flick it across if people are interested. There is a bit, it's growing. It's definitely growing.
Thanks, John. Marie, your question, please.
Yeah, so I work in the homelessness space in WA. So I'm the local community coordinator for the Mandurah and Rockingham Zero project. We use the by names list. Those that work in the homelessness space might be familiar with by names lists. So it's a really good source of data. I'm just curious to know whether you experienced any data integration with the capturing like the death and the heat relating data in the by names lists while you were in the US.
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, we have like the N Street Sleeping collaboration in New South Wales, and I've been involved in designing some of the by name lists to capture more heat-related stuff in there as well. I think in Houston, they did a little bit of work around that integration because they've got a by name list there. So there has been some. I would say Phoenix didn't have a by name list, so I didn't have a good example. I think the hardest thing is just training the emergency departments and coroner's report to actually start recording it. So I'd say the areas where they had good heat data and in terms of presentations, they didn't have a by name list established, or they were using a different system. But I think there's a massive opportunity there. And it goes back to that digital twins conversation. There's so many emerging data points I think we need to start integrating them because I think it just makes it more effective, basically, in terms of how we respond. But yeah, good question.
Great. Other questions? Well, we've still got John. I think, John, something that I'm curious about is, I guess there's levels of a response, right? And for the Northern Territory, particularly when it comes to heat, I feel like we might be starting from the basics. And from what I've seen is you spoke about water security. And that's something that I don't think we manage very well. Like you'll see, and Caitlin, I can see you're nodding your head, like in Darwin, we find that toilets, public toilets will be shut for periods of the day or at night. Like for example, we had this cyclone, and I was listening to the radio, and council came on and said, "Yeah, we've shut all the public toilets." And okay, like can understand that maybe that needs to be done, but not everyone who was rough sleeping
Mm.
was taken into a shelter. So there are a number of people who are going to need to find somewhere safe to shelter from a Category 3 cyclone. And there was no kind of justification for why toilets were shut. Public showers are closed off at night down at the waterfront. And Alice Springs historically also hasn't been great in that space of closing toilets and turning off water fountains. I think it's the same in Tennant Creek. So I think we're talking about kind of just getting some of those basics around friendly infrastructure right, allowing people access to shade infrastructure, water infrastructure, so that they can feel just a little bit safer and cooler during those real heat events. And then it's like really activating a next step once we've got those basics right. So I think that's my sense is that's where we're at the
Yeah.
moment. So it's kind of, I think we need something scalable, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I like the mobile cooling hub is a great example. We started deploying that, and the amount of media and interest we get, because it's just offering a basic amenity to allow people experiencing homelessness cool access. But the public response, the media response on both sides are like, what is this? Why are we doing this? And all of a sudden the conversation starts going. And I think you're right. I think water access was something I'd never considered, but I'm sure like once people start talking about it and identifying it, then it becomes part of that sort of conversation. But I think I think exactly right, Annie. I think we're at that first step. I don't think it is that just meeting those basic needs is the first step. And then I think that generates that conversation, that education.
Great. We've got a few questions. Hannah, I'll go to you first and then Caitlin.
Sorry, I have just parked my car on the side to ask this question. I'm from the family violence sector, and I just wanted to ask, with evidence around climate change and disasters, gender and homelessness, whether in the US or in the work that you're doing, what are some of the deliberate conversations around these kind of cooling shelters or responses and safety for victim survivors of family violence? Because you could have mobile cooling shelters or standalone ones, but a victim survivor might not be able to access that because the perpetrator or people they know might be in the same place. So have there been any deliberate conversations around that?
That is a very good question. And I think it's a question I reckon there's even like, and I'm sure you know, Hannah, as well, there's local examples from some of the recent flooding around that where there was evidence of like, intimate partner violence and stuff like that within these shelters. In the US, the only one I think was probably Phoenix, where there was some examples around that, where they did have if this is answering the question correctly, they did look at that around women's only cooling spaces, like just opportunities. But again, I would say from a heat point of view, it was definitely in its infancy. I think generally within a disaster framework, it's very much in its infancy. I don't think there was no good examples that I saw, I would say, in the US, but I know that there's been some consideration around it.
Thanks, John, because Annie, I think even with the cyclone response, there were emergency shelters, but we just couldn't very safely tell our clients that you could go to these emergency shelters because they could be perpetrators of people using violence.
That's a really good point, Hannah.
Thanks, John.
No, it's okay.
Caitlin.
Thanks, Annie. Thanks, John. I've just noticed the time, so I'll be really quick, except I just want to acknowledge that comment from Hannah, and I know that was certainly an issue in COVID too with the lockdowns, and that it was our sector that had to alert the people helping of the dangers. So a couple of random observations just actually about what Mike was saying about how do you decide what the benchmark is? And I just note that in the Right to Power report that was released last week that talked about people being disconnected from power, and then they talked about a threshold of 40 degrees in the Central Australian region and 36.5 plus 75% humidity in the top end. But it's just interesting that there isn't a standard and accepted benchmark, and in a jurisdiction where there were some quite distinct weather zones, but most notable is that it's almost always hot, and it's always hot in Darwin. But rather than make a bunch of random observations, I just wanted to ask you, and you kind of half addressed it in that comment that you just were talking about Phoenix, is given that the social infrastructure around this is so undeveloped here in the Northern Territory, and particularly we've got a government that doesn't actually have any plans around dealing with climate change, and certainly doesn't have any, commitments in terms of housing having to be climate resilient. Is your thoughts and ideas on how to start getting that discussion amongst the community and amongst services, but in particular amongst political leadership, where those decisions were made about allocating resources?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I think I think it's these conversations are like I guess the nucleus for it. I mean, Jeff Goodall, who wrote the book, it's called Heat in Australia, but he wrote the book The Heat Will Kill You First, which is a great book. Talks about this, where he goes, part of it is like that changing the public discourse is around that sort of I guess middle wealth bracket as well. So you said the interesting ones in Austin, where sports getting so hot they have to cancel like Pee-wee soccer, and all of a sudden that changes how communities and that sort of part of America is starting to look at heat as well, and it sort of then begins to leverage with politicians and government. I think it's going to take. I think things like sweltering cities that Emma Bacon leads is massive, and I think that builds that community groundswell. It is around that social cohesion and community groundswell that we'll start seeing changes. But it's also been, I'm always talking about the NT every time I talk to someone about what's happening in New South Wales. Like, you need to talk to the NT, because I think that's where we need regional remote New South Wales, for example, where the resources are limited, but we need more infrastructure investment. Phoenix, I think it's interesting as well, because, and I'm going off track, I think Jeff was talking about if the power goes down, there's a real chance it could. I think there's some report, they reckon like 10,000 dead within about 48 hours. Like, it's wild, like in the peak of summer. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I think it's that continual advocacy and evidence base, and it's changing culture within Australia, because I think Australians, we always go heat, it's just heat, it's just always hot. And I think it's changing that to say, but I think it's that community, and it's all levels of community, not just the homelessness sector, but people that aren't even connected to homelessness, just talking about heat. It probably doesn't answer your question, Caitlin, but I think these conversations are it just spreads, I think. And
then it's good to just get us thinking, and they're all good points. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
I think a big part of it must be data as well, right? Like, we just don't have the data in the NT on the number of people who are rough sleeping, who are presenting to hospital, emergency departments, and potentially passing away due to heat. Because that's not collected. And I was talking to Dr. Simon Quilty about this recently, and there's like a complicated reason why that's not collected. It's, you have to put your last home address down, and like coroner's reports have to do that. And so it doesn't say that someone has been rough sleeping. So that data is just missed in the Northern Territory. And I don't know if this is Australia-wide, but it's something that is astonishing to me. So that the US, like, because you had some of that data in your report, John, but we're just missing that data in Australia, or in the NT particularly. So how do we tell that story? How do we look for alternative ways of telling that story? And I think therein lies a challenge.
And I think it's, like, not to be too, like, I know it's like not to be too pessimistic, but when I asked like people like Eric Kleinenberg and the public health teams in New York, like, who collect heat death data, and Phoenix even, I said, like, what triggered it, and how do we get it here? And they said, you're just going to have a really bad heat wave, and a lot of people are going to die. And that's what triggered it, basically. That's, like he said, like, like, if you can do it before then, but things like Paris, where they had 35,000 people die in the early 2000s, it changed a lot of how they responded. It's that sort of, you can avoid it because we've got all the evidence to say this is what you need to do. But I think you're right, Annie, it's that data. Otherwise, we're going to get the other data where we're going to get hospital systems overloaded, and then they're going to do a retrospective So yeah, I think the data is the key, and it's like, how do we get that going, basically.
Well, we'll be coming back to you on that. But thank you so much for your time today. It is so appreciated. And thank you to everyone who attended. It's December. I don't know why, but it is such a busy time of the year. I thought we'd all be winding down, but it feels like we're winding up. So thank you all so much, and have a really good rest of the year. And Jon, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for being here. We've recorded this. We'll chuck it up on YouTube, so please share it widely with anyone who might be interested. And yeah, with that, I'll draw everything to a close.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
it was great.
See you all later.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.